Okay, so I'm back here with the same scene. We're continuing here with Irradiance particles. Now in the previous video you saw how to go ahead and activate Irradiance particles. You saw some of the basics. And I went ahead and described some of these parameters to you. In this video we're going to get into a little bit of a more advanced topic. We're going to talk about how to squeeze as much render performance as we can out of Irradiance particles. Okay, so you've already seen that Irradiance particles can take a good while to render, and it's a little bit slow if you're not sure what you're doing. So the idea here is to try to get the best possible render speed with acceptable quality as soon as possible. That's the idea, because we don't want to sit here and wait for a render too long. We want to see how we can balance out speed and quality to give us the best of both worlds. Okay, that's a little bit difficult to do if you're not familiar with any of these settings. So let's go ahead and let's see what settings affect speed here the most, and which ones we could tweak to get ourselves some good performance. Okay, so we've already seen how long it takes to render out with 64 rays here and a density of 0.1. We also saw how the rebuild option down here can help us to freeze up our Irradiance particles map, which can be pretty useful. And we also saw how to use the output window here to get some information here related to our render, which is extremely important. Okay. Now before we continue, there's a couple of key things that I want you to keep in mind as we work with Irradiance particles. Number one, Irradiance particles are view dependent, just like when we were looking at importance, and very similar to final gathering. Okay, if I have rebuild turned off, essentially I'm freezing the Irradiance particles map. I can rotate my camera around a bit and do a render from a different angle. And what you're going to notice is that the Irradiance particles don't get anything that's outside the view of the camera. We end up with a pretty bad result here, which is obviously no good. We can see that we end up with this nasty artifacting back here. That's because Irradiance particles work with importance. Irradiance particles and importance were designed for as an importance-driven algorithm. What that means is that it's all based on the camera view. They basically try to create an algorithm that will render as fast as possible, and one of the ways they found that you can do that is by focusing in on what's important. And what could be more important than what you're looking at through your camera view? So you can see that it didn't render out too nicely back here, and over here where the camera was able to capture some of that area, it did a really good job, but right here it didn't. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind. Let me go ahead and close that. Let me use the left bracket key a couple of times to go back to our previous view. There we go. Okay, and let me go ahead and bring back that render. Okay, so what are the two main things that are going to affect render speed as well as the render quality when using Irradiance particles? The first thing that's going to impact render time dramatically is the density up here for the importance. Right now it's set to 0.1, which isn't really a lot. Now the default setting, if you remember, was 1, and that is overkill. That's just way too many importance, especially if you start using the max step setting and start bouncing some of those importance around in your scene. Now you're going to get yourself some really long render times. However, keep in mind that a good amount of density is needed of importance in order to get yourself a good Irradiance particle render. So that's another key thing to keep in mind. Despite the fact that lots of importance at high density equals high render times, it also means better quality in the end for your Irradiance particles. And the second setting that controls the speed and the quality of Irradiance particles is the rays parameter down here. The lower the amount of rays, the lower the quality, but the faster the render. The higher the amount of rays, the higher the quality, but the slower the render is going to take. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. Now, there's one other key thing here. Since the rays parameter and the density parameter work together and can affect each other dramatically in terms of render times and quality, one question that you have to ask yourself is, well, what's going to give me a better and faster result? If I use a high density and a low number of rays, is that going to give me a great result fast? Or will using a low density and a high number of rays give me a great result fast? That is a good question. And the truth is that you're going to be pretty surprised when you see this. So let's go ahead and do a little experiment here. We're going to do a little test here to see which one renders the best and which one renders the fastest. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to turn rebuild on, and I'm going to leave my rays set to 64. Now 64 is a very low number of rays. That's only good for preview rendering. You can't get away with production render with 64 rays. Now the density is now set at 1. That's a pretty high number of importons. That's going to create hundreds of thousands of importons, which is actually a very large amount of importons, and in many cases it's overkill. It's too many. You really don't need that many, and you're just adding wasted render time to your work. But we're going to go ahead and leave this at a density of 1 just for testing purposes. And the raise parameter we're going to leave at 64. Everything else we'll just leave alone. I'm going to make sure that environment is left off. I don't want to use environment at the moment. I'm trying to focus on the direct lighting here coming from the Irradiance particles as opposed to any environment lighting. Okay, so if the density is set at 1, the raise set at 64, let's go ahead and let's create another render. We can see the importon emission there. Going by pretty quick. And let's open up the output window here. And we can see already we have over 300,000 irradiance particles or importons. That is a lot of importons. In fact, I'm willing to bet that's just way too many importons for this scene. But that is the default setting. The default setting is 1. And if 1 was the default setting, then we'll go ahead and we'll use that. Okay, so it just finished optimizing the irradiance particles here. 303,271. It's a lot of irradiance particles, a lot of importons there for the irradiance particles to have to work with. Even though it's only 64 rays, that's still going to be a lot of importons that those rays have to work with. And when those rays have to work with a lot of importons, it's going to slow things down, especially if you have a high number of rays. That's really going to slow things down dramatically. It's going to bring them to a crawl. Okay, so you can see in the lower left of the interface the status bar here for this phase here where mental rays preparing the irradiance particles. Okay, that's going to take a pretty good while. So what I'm going to do is pause the video and I'll come back when it's finished. Alright, so it just finished. Let me go ahead and hide that output window. So this is what we ended up with. Took down here render time 3 minutes 44 seconds for me to render this out. And as you can see, there's a ton of artifacting all over the place, especially on the walls. Not as much on the floor and the ceiling, although the ceiling does have its fair share of artifacting, but the walls are heavily pockmarked with artifacts all over the place. And it took a whole 3 minutes 44 seconds. And it took a whole 3 minutes and 44 seconds to render that out. Now overall, that's not really a long time, but let's see if we can get that time lowered. Now that was with a density of 1, which came out to over 300,000 importons, and a raise parameter of only 64. And because the raise parameter was set to only 64, that's the reason why we're getting all this artifacting. So to get rid of this artifacting, what we could do now is increase this amount of rays to a very high number, something like 500. The problem is, when you use 500 rays with a density of 1, this render time is going to shoot through the roof. Don't be surprised if you're here for about half an hour rendering out just the irradiance particles map with those settings. But that's not what we want to do. We don't want to do that because that's a big waste of time, and usually you'll have some client that needs the work done by a specific date. So what are we going to do about this? How can we solve this problem? Well, since high density and low rays equals long render times with bad quality, let's try low density. So let's try something like 0.1. And let's try a high number of rays. Let's try 500 rays. And we'll go ahead and we'll render this out. But before I do, I'm going to save this image so I can compare and contrast later. I'm going to go ahead and render this out with only a density of 0.1. So it should be about 10% of the importons as there were before. Let's open up the output window, and there we go. Only about 30,000 importons this time. I know it says irradiance particles here, but it's really talking about the importons, even though it says irradiance particles. So we've got 30,309 importons here, but we do have 500 rays, and those 500 rays have to work with those 30,000 irradiance particles, or importons I should say. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, and I'll come back when this is finished, and we'll compare the two images and see what we got. Alright, it just finished. Let me go ahead and hide the output window. And whoa, look what we got here. Very, very interesting. All the artifacting went away. We have ourselves a pretty clean render. I mean, the only thing left now is to increase the anti-aliasing, and that's it. We'll have ourselves a good render. So we can see that we got rid of all the artifacting on the edges of the floor, the ceiling, and most definitely the most notable difference is the walls. The walls are not filled with all those artifacts from before. And surprisingly enough, this render time was only 2 minutes and 24 seconds. Interesting. So here's the before, and here's the after. In the before render, it took longer to render, and the quality was unacceptable. The quality was so bad that it was totally unacceptable, has to be thrown away, and the work has to be done again. With the new render, the time for rendering was faster, and the quality was better. So as you can see, when you're familiar with these settings, and you know exactly how to tweak them, and what to do with them, you can go ahead and squeeze out not just quality, but performance. You can render out faster and better when you know exactly what it is that you're doing here. So the trick is to use the least amount of portons possible. If you see you have any artifacts here or something's unacceptable, start to increase the density by very small amounts. You don't want to increase it by too much. You don't want to go from 0.1, for example, all of a sudden to 0.5 or to 1. You want to increase maybe from 0.1, maybe to 0.2, maybe to 0.15. Small numbers are your friend here because they're going to go ahead and introduce just the right amount of importance for your scene. And for rays, we always have to use a pretty high number of rays to get ourselves an artifact-free render. And although you may not like the sounds of that, the truth is that a high number of rays doesn't equal long render times. It's a high number of density that equals high render times. Fortunately, the density doesn't impact the quality as much as the rays. So we can actually get away with rendering an image with a low density and a high number of rays as opposed to rendering out with high density and a low number of rays. So that's the trick. Low density, just enough importance for the scene to render out nicely, and a high number of rays to get rid of any artifacts that just show up. And those are all very important things to keep in mind and remember every time you work with Irradiance particles. Because if you don't, you're going to end up running into situations where you may not be using the most optimal settings for your scene, and that could mean the difference between rendering in 2 minutes and rendering in 20 minutes, or rendering in 30 minutes. So, very important, and keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video, we're going to talk about these environment parameters down here a little more in depth, and see how they work, how to tweak them, and what we can do with them. So I'll see you then.